The streets of Gaza City are eerily quiet. The usual bustling markets and busy thoroughfares have been replaced by an unsettling stillness. This silence is punctuated only by the distant rumble of explosions and sporadic gunfire. Israeli forces have intensified their operations in Gaza City, targeting what they claim are Hamas strongholds. The Israeli military says this offensive is necessary to root out militants and destroy tunnel networks. But the cost to civilian life and infrastructure is mounting by the hour. Hamas has responded with fierce resistance, launching rockets into Israeli territory and engaging in street battles. The United Nations has called for an immediate ceasefire, warning of a humanitarian catastrophe. Both sides remain committed to their military objectives, leaving civilians caught in the crossfire. Israeli tanks and armored vehicles rumble through the rubble-strewn streets of Gaza City. Soldiers move cautiously, weapons at the ready, met with sniper fire and improvised explosive devices. The Israeli military says it's making progress in dismantling Hamas's military infrastructure. Residential areas have been reduced to ruins and hospitals are overwhelmed with casualties. The Israeli military insists it's taking precautions to minimize civilian casualties. But the United Nations reports that hundreds of Palestinians, many of them women and children, have been killed. Hamas fighters are dug in, using Gaza's complex urban landscape to their advantage. The situation on the ground is chaotic and fluid, with conflicting accounts of battles and casualties. Gaza City, once home to over 500,000 people, is now a battleground with residents trapped between advancing Israeli forces and Hamas fighters.
We've been without water for days. The children are terrified. Every explosion makes them scream.
We're running out of everything. Medicines, bandages, even clean water. We're performing surgeries without anesthesia.
The hospital, like many others in Gaza, is struggling to cope with the influx of wounded while facing severe shortages.
This is my land. Where should I go? I've lived through many wars, but this is the worst. They're destroying everything.
His words reflect the sentiment of many Gazans who feel they have no safe haven.
My university is in ruins. My books are buried under rubble. How can we have a future when they're destroying everything we've built?
Her words underscore the long-term impact of the conflict on Gaza's youth and the territory's future prospects.
We just want peace. We want our children to grow up without fear.
The voices of Gaza's civilians paint a harrowing picture of life under siege. The fate of hostages held by Hamas is a critical factor in the conflict. Families of the captives, mostly Israeli civilians taken during Hamas's October 7th attack, are calling for their release. Sarah, whose brother is among the hostages, says, "Every day is agony. The government must do everything to bring them home." Israel's government insists the military operation is necessary to secure the hostages' release. Critics argue the intense military campaign may put the hostages at greater risk. The situation has created a complex web of negotiations involving international mediators. The humanitarian situation in Gaza has reached catastrophic levels. The United Nations reports that over 1 million people have been displaced, many crowding into UN-run shelters that are now at breaking point. These facilities lack adequate food, water, and sanitation, raising fears of disease outbreaks. Access to basic necessities has become a daily struggle for Gaza's residents. Clean water is scarce, with most of the territory's water infrastructure damaged or destroyed. Electricity is available for only a few hours a day, if at all, severely impacting hospitals and families.
Children are particularly vulnerable to the crisis. UNICEF reports that thousands of children are at risk of severe malnutrition and psychological trauma.
The blockade of Gaza has severely restricted the entry of humanitarian aid. While some convoys have been allowed through, aid agencies say it's nowhere near enough to meet the enormous need. The international community is calling for humanitarian corridors to be established, but so far, these calls have not been heeded by the warring parties. As the conflict in Gaza intensifies, peace seems increasingly distant. Diplomatic efforts to broker a ceasefire have failed to gain traction. The United States supports Israel's right to defend itself but faces pressure to push for a ceasefire. Countries like Egypt and Qatar play crucial roles in back-channel negotiations. The long-term implications are profound. Even if a ceasefire is reached, Gaza's devastation will take years to rebuild. The cycle of violence has deepened mistrust, making future peace negotiations challenging. There are concerns the conflict could spread, drawing in other regional actors. Without a fundamental shift, lasting peace will remain elusive.